There are men who survive war. There are men who survive the wilderness. And then there are men like Edward Vernon Rickenbacker who survived it all. A race car driver who danced with death at 100 miles per hour. A World War I ace who took down 26 enemy planes. A business mogul who reinvented aviation, and a castaway who drifted across the Pacific for 24 days, clinging to life on a rubber raft while sharks circled below and the sun boiled from above. This is a story of survival, not once, not twice, but again and again. It's a story of grit, discipline, and a man who refused to die. Edward Vernon Rickenbacker was born on October 8, 1890, in Columbus, Ohio, the third of 8 children to Swiss immigrants. His father, Wilhelm, was a stonemason, strict, hard-working, and harsh. By age 5, Edward already understood that life was about survival, not comfort. His mother gave him a Swiss pocket knife. His father gave him hard truths. Tragedy struck when Edward was just 13 years old. His father got into a fight at work and later died of injuries. Overnight, young Eddie became the man of the house. He dropped out of school to earn money, sweeping floors, fixing machines, and pushing himself harder than anyone else his age. But Edward had a secret obsession, speed, and he found it in the loudest, fastest machine of the era, the automobile. By the time he was 20, he was one of the country's most famous race car drivers. His name became synonymous with daring and danger. Edward Fast Eddie Rickenbacker drove in the Indianapolis 504 times before 1917, reaching speeds most men feared. He crashed more than once. One wreck sent him skidding on his side at 80 miles per hour. He crawled from the twisted metal, bloodied but smiling. He wasn't fearless. He just knew how to dance with death. In 1917, the U.S. entered World War I, and Edward volunteered. At first, the Army didn't take him seriously. He was too old to be a pilot, already 26. Worse, he didn't have a college degree, and some officers looked down on his grease-stained past. So they made him a chauffeur for high-ranking generals. But Rickenbacker had other plans. In France, he befriended officers in the fledgling U.S. Army Air Service, learning everything he could about aircraft maintenance and navigation. When a slot finally opened in flight school, he pounced. He barely passed, not because he lacked skill, but because he had to fight bureaucracy every step of the way. By early 1918, he was finally in the sky, and he was lethal. Flying in World War I was a death sentence. Planes were fragile, engines unreliable, parachutes non-existent. The average life expectancy for a combat pilot was 17 days. Edward beat the odds again, and again, and again. Flying a SPAD S-13, he shot down 26 enemy aircraft, becoming America's top flying ace. He earned the Medal of Honor and the nickname Ace of Aces. But each kill came with a price. He saw friends explode mid-air. He once landed with a bullet lodged in his leg, barely conscious. Another time, his plane stalled at 10,000 feet. He managed to restart it, 100 feet from the ground. He survived 134 aerial engagements, flew with torn wings, cracked goggles, and sometimes no ammunition at all. Yet he kept going, not for glory, but for the men he flew beside. Rickenbacker once said, "Courage is doing what you're afraid to do. There can be no courage unless you're scared." When the Great War ended in 1918, Edward Rickenbacker returned to America not as a soldier, but a legend. He could have lived comfortably, giving speeches, signing autographs, but Edward never chased comfort. He chased legacy. In the 1920s, America was just beginning to look to the skies for travel. Rickenbacker saw it coming. He bought into early commercial airlines, helped design aircraft, and eventually became the head of Eastern Airlines. He didn't just lead from behind a desk. He flew the routes himself, checked engines by hand, and made frontline decisions that shaped the future of modern flight. But as always, danger followed him. In 1935, he bought the failing Eastern Airlines and turned it into a powerhouse. But Rickenbacker's leadership wasn't just bold, it was brutal. He demanded perfection, fired entire crews for small errors. He once said, "The four horsemen of the air are ignorance, stupidity, carelessness, and overconfidence." His hard edge won him enemies, but it also saved lives. In 1941, Rickenbacker boarded a flight from New York to Atlanta that would change his life forever. On February 26, 1941, Rickenbacker boarded an Eastern Airlines District of Columbia 3. He sat near the front. The takeoff was smooth, the skies calm. But then, a malfunction. A cockpit gauge failed to warn the pilots about a retracted landing gear. The plane struck a tree during landing, flipped, and slammed into the ground. It tore open like a tin can. Rickenbacker was pinned between wreckage and steel. His skull was fractured, his eyeball dislodged, his hip was crushed. But he refused to die. Doctors were certain he wouldn't last the night. He lasted months, endured 13 major fractures, lost partial vision, could barely walk. But by the end of the year, he was back at work. The crash taught him something deeper. Death was never far. But it hadn't beaten him yet. So when the U.S. military asked for his help again, this time during World War II, he said yes without hesitation. In October 1942, Rickenbacker, now 52, was asked to deliver a confidential message to General Douglas MacArthur in the South Pacific. He boarded a B-17 Flying Fortress with 7 others, including pilot Captain William Cherry and co-pilot Captain John DeAngelis. They flew out of Hawaii and into the open Pacific. But something went wrong. A navigational error placed them hundreds of miles off course. With fuel running out, the bomber began to sputter. The men looked out and saw nothing but ocean. Rickenbacker turned to the pilot and said calmly, "Well, I guess this is it." The plane crash-landed into the Pacific. The impact was violent but not fatal. All 8 men scrambled out and into 3 rubber life rafts. The plane sank within minutes. The nearest land was 1,000 miles away. They had no radio, no sails, barely any food or water. Just the sun, the ocean, and each other. What followed was one of the most harrowing survival stories in American military history. For the first day, they were hopeful. By the second day, they were sunburnt. By the third, one of them would be dead. Day 1 on the raft felt like the beginning of an inconvenience. Day 2 felt like the beginning of a nightmare. There were 8 men in 3 tiny rubber rafts. Edward Rickenbacker, Captain William Cherry, Captain John DeAngelis, Sergeant James Reynolds, Private John Bartek, Lieutenant James Whitaker, Staff Sergeant Alexander Kaczmarczyk, Private Harold Dixon. Each man had a few survival rations, chocolate bars, emergency drinking water, and a fishing kit. That was it. By day 3, the chocolate was gone. The sun blazed from above, the salt burned their skin, and no planes came. Then, on the evening of day 3, Kaczmarczyk died. He had suffered a head injury in the crash, and the heat pushed him into delirium. He whispered about being cold, about his mother, about dying. Then he stopped. They held a burial at sea. No prayers, just tears. Rickenbacker said later that this was the most dangerous moment of all, not because of the death, but because of what it did to morale. Starvation set in. The days blurred together. The men became burned, blistered, and bloated from drinking seawater in desperation. Sharks began circling. The scent of blood and vomit in the water drew them like magnets. Then, on day 8, something miraculous happened. The men were sleeping in shifts, if they could sleep at all. Suddenly, Rickenbacker felt a thud on his head. He looked up. A seagull had landed on his cap. Moving slowly, barely breathing, he reached up and grabbed it with both hands. They tore the bird apart with shaking fingers. The raw meat went down like fire. The guts were used as bait for fishing. For the first time, they had protein and hope. But nature wasn't done testing them. Sharks, some as long as the rafts, began brushing up against the rubber. They slapped at them with oars. One man stabbed one with a knife. They slept in constant terror, wondering if the next bump would be the one that flipped them. Rain came on day 11. They drank like animals, catching drops in open mouths and cupped hands. But the storms passed quickly, and the heat returned. Men began hallucinating. Some saw cities on the horizon, others claimed to hear music. One man tried to jump out, convinced he saw land just beneath the water. Rickenbacker kept order by sheer force of will. Rickenbacker's journal, actual quote, "I swore to each of them, you will live if you listen to me. I demand discipline." He created routines, assigned roles, even insisted on taking turns talking to maintain sanity. The days kept passing. No rescue. Just burning sun, rotting feet, cracked lips, and the same prayer whispered each morning, "Please, let today be the day." On day 24, they saw a speck on the horizon. It grew larger. Wings. A plane. They waved frantically. Shirts, flares, anything. The plane circled once and vanished. Hours later, a U.S. Navy patrol boat approached. The men had been spotted. They were going home. Rickenbacker had lost 40 pounds. His skin was peeling from sun exposure. He couldn't walk on swollen feet. But all 7 survivors were alive. When asked how they survived, Rickenbacker simply said, "We believed we would." He didn't mention the sharks, or the corpse, or the crying at night. He just walked off the boat, slowly, and got back to work. He went back to Eastern Airlines, back to writing, back to life. But the sea never really left him. Edward Vernon Rickenbacker had faced every nightmare imaginable. The war-torn skies over Europe. The twisted wreckage of a plane crash. The bone-dry, shark-infested waters of the Pacific. And through it all, he never gave in. After surviving 24 days lost at sea, Rickenbacker returned home as more than a war hero. He was now a symbol of endurance. A walking reminder that discipline, faith, and mental toughness could defy even nature itself. He resumed work as the head of Eastern Airlines and remained there until 1959. He turned a fledgling airline into a commercial powerhouse, but his leadership style never softened. Rickenbacker demanded excellence because he had seen what happened when men slipped, even once. He also wrote books, including Seven Came Through, a memoir of his survival at sea, and Rickenbacker, a full autobiography that recounted the highs and horrors of a life spent dancing with death. Even in retirement, Rickenbacker didn't rest. He traveled the world with his wife, inspecting aviation developments and advising military leaders. He became a kind of wandering sage, the old survivor, weathered but wise. On July 23, 1973, while on a business trip to Switzerland, Edward Rickenbacker passed away after a stroke. He was 82 years old. He died peacefully, a luxury he had rarely known. He was buried in Columbus, Ohio, next to his beloved wife, Adelaide. But his story was far from buried. Today, Edward Rickenbacker is remembered not just as a pilot or a businessman or a survivor, but as a man who looked death in the eyes again and again and refused to blink. A man who said, "Courage is doing what you're afraid to do," and then proved it over and over again. His story reminds us that the human spirit can endure fire, steel, and even the endless ocean, if it holds on to one thing: the will to survive. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of real survival, subscribe, like, and follow for more true stories of courage, loss, and resilience. This is the channel where we remember those who fought to live and lived to tell it. Until next time, stay safe, stay strong, and never give up.